The Sony A7R V is the highest resolution full-frame camera, and it might be the perfect hybrid camera. So I tried this camera out on several different shoots to really put it to the test, and while the A7R V produces some absolutely gorgeous images, it does have some downsides as well. So in this video, let's talk about my experiences shooting on the A7R V for the last 6 months, along with the pros and cons, and why I think the A7R V is the perfect hybrid camera. But most importantly, if this camera is right for you. Also, I'll leave links down below for the best pricing on the A7R V. Now, the coolest thing about the A7R V is the incredible sensor. Most cameras have a 24, maybe 33 megapixel sensor, 45 if you're really pushing it. But the A7R V actually has a 60 megapixel full frame sensor that's nearly double the resolution of most full frame cameras. And 60 megapixels gives you an insane amount of resolution that has benefits for both photos and videos. With photo, you can zoom in and see even the tiniest little bit of detail in any of your photos. And the A7R V is also one of the few mirrorless cameras on the market right now that can actually shoot 8K video. But before you get too excited, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, and there's a few things you should know about when it comes to 8K video. One thing that really impressed me about the A7R V when it first launched, and even to this day, is the autofocusing system. Lately, AI-based autofocus is a term that pretty much gets thrown around everywhere, and pretty much every camera seems to have AI-based autofocus. But even almost a year later since this camera's been out, the AI-based autofocus is still the most advanced autofocusing system on the planet. And it's absolutely ridiculous how sticky and reliable this autofocusing system is. And that's mainly because it's so fast when it comes to eye detect, face detect, back of the head detect. It's so fast in doing pose estimation that it almost already knows where the subject's going next, and it's already pulling focus to it. And the A7R V also has subject detection for not only humans, animals, and cars, but also other things like airplanes, trains, insects, and the list goes on. There's almost nothing that this camera's autofocus cannot keep up with. Now, I did end up shooting a basketball game with this camera, and for something like this, I just want to focus on composition and let the camera do all the heavy lifting when it comes to autofocus. With the A7R V, I can simply tap the joystick on the back and it will automatically start face tracking. And it can even detect multiple faces at once, and I can use the D-pad in the back to switch between the multiple faces. In terms of speed and reliability, the autofocusing system in this camera is truly next gen. It just does not miss. But one thing I should mention is that the A7R V is not the only camera with this system anymore. You can even find it in cheaper cameras like the Sony A6700 and the Sony A7C Mark II, and even the Sony A7C-R, which is basically a smaller version of the A7R V, but that's a camera for a different video. Now, the key thing about the A7R V is how ridiculously powerful this camera is, and it can do so much with the sensor and autofocusing combo. So let's talk about exactly what it's like to shoot with this camera, and thankfully, I've gotten the chance to push this camera pretty hard on several shoots. So first, let's talk about photos. In photo mode, the A7R V can shoot at a pretty reasonable 10 frames per second. It would be nice to have this camera shoot faster, but you have to remember, it's 60 megapixels of resolution, and most cameras with this much resolution do not shoot this fast. So 10 frames per second is still pretty respectable, and it's good enough for most medium action. If you're shooting a model with a little bit of movement or even sports, 10 frames per second is more than enough. And when it comes to serious photography, it's not just about how fast you can shoot, but also how long you can shoot. And the A7R V has a really impressive frame buffer. But in order to get the best results from this camera, it also depends on what kind of card you're shooting on. If you're using a faster CF Express type card that has anywhere between about 1700 megabits per second in terms of write speed, you can actually shoot 538 raw frames per second. Let me repeat that for you. 538 raw frames per second, which might as well just be unlimited, because who's really shooting 500 raw photos? But a CF Express Type A card can be pretty expensive, and they can be several $100s. Most of us, including myself, are just shooting on a standard V90 SD card, which is about $100. On a standard V90, you can get about 42 uncompressed photos, 49 lossless compressed photos, and you can double that to 89 compressed photos. But the one thing about continuous shooting is that instead of getting 14-bit RAW, which is kind of the standard now, in continuous shooting mode with compressed RAW, you actually only get 12-bit color, and that's basically the difference between 10-bit color and 8-bit color. So for most of us, we probably want to shoot with 14-bit RAW. Now, when it comes to video, this is where the A7R V absolutely blew me away and why I think this camera is the perfect hybrid camera. For most hybrid shooters like myself, this has the exact specs that we've all been waiting for. Most of the video that I shoot is usually handheld video, and I was absolutely stunned by how smooth the stabilization was. I shot just using a top handle and a monitor, and I was really surprised by how smooth and stable everything was. Even when I was moving fast or doing walking shots, there didn't seem to be any sort of up and down wobble, but on top of that, there was no sort of like jitteriness or shakiness to my footage. For most of my video work, I use an R6 Mark II, an FX3, and an A7S III, and this camera has better stabilization than all of those cameras. Just so you don't think I'm lying, here's all the cameras I just mentioned. And you can also pair the A7R V with a Sony stabilized lens to get even better results. Next up, let's talk about the video frame rates and specs in this camera and how it compares to other popular video cameras. The A7R V can shoot 4K 24 and 30 frames per second without any sort of crop, and the footage quality is pretty much on par with my FX3, and for most video shooters, that's a pretty big deal. The A7R V also shoots 4K at 60 frames per second with a very slight 1.2 times crop. Again, you're really not going to notice that crop, so in my opinion, you might as well call it uncropped. And if I can get 4K 60 that's as good as the FX3, that's a pretty good deal. And the A7R V also has full HD slow motion at 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second, also in 10-bit 422 color. But one thing that is missing is that the A7R V does not downsample its footage despite having a high resolution sensor. For someone like me, I just need standard 4K, so for me it's good enough, but if you do want oversampled 4K, you can actually go into the 4K APS-C crop mode, which will give you oversampled footage from 6.2K at 4K 24 frames per second and 4K 30 frames per second. Sadly, it is not downsampled when it comes to 4K at 60 frames per second. It's not ideal, but I'll take it. And the data rates on the A7R V are pretty much on par with all the other popular Sony cameras. You get anywhere between 240 megabits per second to 600 megabits per second when shooting on the highest 4K setting. And you can also record ProRes RAW using the full-size HDMI out in this camera or just a clean HDMI out feed and get 10-bit 422 color in ProRes. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The A7R V does have 8K video, but is it actually that good, and is it actually worth getting this camera just for the 8K video? Well, it does have some upsides, but also two major downsides. The first upside being that it's just cool to see 8K video in a camera like this. If you're doing any kind of product photography, any kind of corporate shoots, having that amount of resolution and being able to crop in and really play around with your frame is a really interesting feature to have. And if you're making vertical content for social media, cropping from an 8K video file is going to look a lot better than cropping from a 4K video file. So if you're doing any kind of vertical content, this 8K feature just might be for you. But the 8K does have two major downsides. One, the 8K video only shoots in 420 color and not 422 10-bit color, which means you're not going to get the same color flexibility as you would otherwise with the 4K video in this camera. For most of you guys, you actually may not notice unless you're really heavily grading these video files, but you will have issues when you're doing low light shooting in 8K and color grading it. This again is a pretty niche complaint, but something that I really thought I should mention. One thing that pretty much everyone's gonna have a problem with is the rolling shutter on this camera. It's really, really, really bad. The 8K video is a really good feature to have in this camera, but only for stable and static shots. So next up, let's talk about design and how absolutely amazing it is. Because in this camera, there's one feature that I think a lot of hybrid shooters have been waiting for. It may not seem that fancy on the surface, but I promise you it's going to make a world of difference. But first, let's talk about the outside of this camera. In my hands, the A7R V pretty much feels identical to the Sony A7S III, and that's a camera that is known for how amazing the design is. It's a nice, robust camera. It does not feel hollow whatsoever. It has a really nice, solid grip to it, and it's not the heaviest camera in the world. Even with like a top handle, a monitor on this camera, it still feels light enough to do handheld shooting with. Two features that I think hybrid shooters are going to love about this camera is one, it has a dial to quickly switch between photo, video, and slow motion, and on the mode dial itself, it has 3 custom presets. So if you want, you can set one up for photos, one up for 4K 60, one up for 4K at 24, and it's going to make it that much easier when you're doing run and gun shooting. And speaking of run and gun shooting, this is the feature that I love about this camera. On the back, you have an LCD tilt screen that's also a side articulating screen. This is the feature that's going to change the game when it comes to hybrid run and gun shooting. So many times I need to get my screen in a specific position, even if I have a monitor on, but I just can't get the right screen position. And once you try this screen, it's going to make such a huge difference in the quality of life, in the speed of your workflow. When it comes to running gun shooting, you're not going to use any other camera. This may seem like it's just like a surface level thing, it can't be that big of a deal, but once you get your hands on it, it's a game changer. And the quality of the screen on the back is also really impressive. Compared to my A7S III, you immediately notice the difference. The A7R V actually has a 1.2 million dot screen that is also significantly brighter than my A7S III screen. And the trend continues when I look at the R6 Mark II compared to the A7R V. I'm usually someone that doesn't care about the LCD screen, mainly because I'm just using it to compose, check autofocus, and most of the times I have a pretty expensive monitor on top of my camera. But if you're someone that wants a good screen, this screen really looks good. Now, it's pretty obvious that I love the A7R V and I do think it is the perfect hybrid camera, but that doesn't mean it's right for you. So who exactly should be buying this camera and who should stay away from it? If you're looking for a high-end hybrid camera that has a ridiculous amount of resolution, 4K video up to 60 frames per second that is as good as an FX3, the A7R V is a super solid buy. But I don't love the 8K video in this camera. For the same price, I could get a Canon R5C or a Nikon Z8, which actually does 8K video a lot better. They do have their own shortcomings in different departments, but that's for another video. But if you're someone that really sees 8K as the next leap in your workflow for what you can do with cameras, this is probably not the camera to get for 8K video. Now, one thing I love about this camera is the screen on the back, how good the EVF is, the design overall is super robust. But if you're someone that doesn't need professional design and you just like this camera for the high resolution sensor and the 4K 60 uncropped, another camera that might be better for you is the Sony A7R. It's basically the same camera with a little less power, but a much smaller body, and also it's significantly cheaper, and that might be a better camera for someone who's a hobbyist or an enthusiast and maybe not a professional. Personally, I'm a professional, so the A7R V is my pick for the best hybrid camera, but that's also a camera to consider. But regardless of whatever camera you pick up, whether it's the A7R V, the Canon R5C, or the A7CR, whatever camera you pick up, you wanna make sure you get the best possible price. So like always, I'll leave links down below for the best possible pricing on all the cameras we talk about today, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.